ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to be here. My name is Vincent Gautrais. I'm a law professor here in the Faculty of Law. I'm the holder of the chair in e-commerce law, and I have the pleasure to be the PI of SHIRK, which is a main Canadian grant for research in social science. And received 2 years ago, some of you, my colleagues who are here, I see Professor Harry Taltaba, a specialist in comparative law, my colleague Sonia Yaya, Other University, and 3 other colleagues, Arthur Boulay from Sherbrooke, Jean Bouchard from Sherbrooke, and I think, and Lady Zanou, of course, from UQO. So all of them, we receive a grant to working on the notion of decolonisation and how there is some impact, legal impact from the knowledge to the stars. And after almost 2 years of reflection about the notions, we would like to think about by inviting some people well known in the field, working for years on this notion. And it was a pleasure. We have pleasure today to have 2 influent researchers with 2 different perspectives. The first one would be Professor Rolf Michael from Germany, and I'm sorry, I have a document with all my notes and my video, and I don't know where it is, but I lost my this document, and hopefully Alexei, which is a person you deal with, he is the coordinator of this project. It's a PhD candidate here at UDM in Paris too, and hopefully Alex, thank you so much. So give me back your 2 bio, and you will see we have 2 stellar researchers on this domain. At the beginning, we thought to bring you here in person in Montreal, but for different reasons, it was more convenient to do it online. But thank you so much to be here. So the first speaker will be, as I mentioned, Ralph Michaels. Ralph is director of the Max Planck Institute for Comparative and International Private Law in Hamburg, Germany. He is holder of a chair in global law at Queen Mary University in London, and he is also a professor of law of Hamburg University. This is a huge specialist on private international law, and anyway, BO is on the website of the chair. But to be honest, Professor Michael sent us a paper. I think it's a work in progress paper about the influence of decolonial approach in international law perspective. And I think in 35, 40 minutes, you will really have the privilege to listen to your presentations about this work in progress paper. After that, we have to Professor Toussaint Nothias. I see 1 year ago, I think, a paper, very interesting paper on this notion of decolonizations. Toussaint, as I mentioned, a very different perspective. Is a clinical associate professor in experimental humanity and social engagement, affiliate faculty in media, culture, and communication at NYU, New York University. Previously, as a research director of the Digital Civil Society Lab and the senior researcher scholar at Stanford University. So, as you see in the very short description, the perspective is different, and in experience, you will have the opportunity to give some free comments about the presentation of Professor Michaels. So after that, if you respect your time, we will have with people in the room here, and people online. We will have the privilege to have discussions to perspective and presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to be here. And the mic is to you, Professor Margaret.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Je vous remercie de l'invitation. Je m'excuse de ne pas être là personnellement pour des raisons surtout politiques, pour la situation politique. Normalement, je serais à New York, à la NYU, avec Toussaint peut-être. Mais nous vivons dans une situation politique assez grave et dramatique. Il y a des événements fréquents et d'une certaine manière, les sujets, les thèmes de ma présentation et de votre recherche en général sont très actuels dans la situation maintenant. Donc, peut-être que c'est une excuse pour moi de ne pas être là. I will present in English. I hope that is okay for everyone. And I will try to not be too long because obviously we want to have time to discuss. Let me see if this works. Does this work? Can you see the presentation? Toussaint can see it, that is already something. So I want to talk about a doctor in a field that has the reputation of being fairly technical. In some way that's true, and in some other ways the technical can be vicious too. And so I want to look at the coloniality of this seemingly technical discipline. And I think if you want my results in the beginning, in the first minute in which the attention span is still there, then the first claim is that the extraterritoriality inherent in private international law often works as a continuation of coloniality. And second, the universalism in private international law also works as a continuation of coloniality. I'll try to explain that over the next 30 minutes or so. I say maybe in advance that what I mean by coloniality obviously is not colonialism, it is not post-colonialism, it is a kind of epistemic, economic, and military hierarchy between North and South in which Northern thought, Northern ideas are universalized, if you want, imposed on the rest of the world. I suppose fairly familiar kinds of ideas to most of you, so I won't go into that longer. Is private international law colonial? Most people would say no, it's only technical first, and second, it really treats all legal systems alike. This man, Upendra Bakshi, would say yes, or did so in a Hague lecture some 25 years ago or so, where he says, modern law's episteme is inescapably colonial and racist, and private international law cannot escape the, as it were, original sin. What is surprising is the fact that the stories about the origins and growth of private international law rarely employ this motif. Insofar as there exists a private international law historiography, and there does actually, we have a fair amount of such works, it chooses not to dwell on the colonial imperialistic origins of this juristic and juridical field, and thus organizes an amnesia and an organized self-forgetting of its racist and colonial origins. This carries grave costs in contemporary times, with the birthmarks of the field do not remain amenable to any order of historical reflexivity. And I think Upendra Bakshi is right, and I want to really try to explain why I think he's right. So I want to first give a brief introduction to what private international law is, in case that you're not so familiar with it. I want to then suggest why it is a specifically European discipline, and by European I also mean the influence on North America, the United States, and Canada. I then emphasize what is often not emphasized, the deeply colonial background on it. And then I talk about the colonial continuity and what I call here false universalism, and I lay out what a research program would look like. So what do we mean by private international law first? Essentially, and I hope this is the right version of my slides, I have several slides. In a narrow sense, private international law is that area of the law that deals with transnational private relations, so contracts, torts, marriages. In the narrowest sense, it has three parts. One is jurisdiction, one is applicable law, choice of law, and one is recognition and enforcement. There's first the question which courts have jurisdiction, which courts are entitled to decide a litigation. Secondly, which law will they apply? Will they apply their own law? Will they apply foreign law? And third, under what circumstances, conditions can the decisions from one legal system be recognized and enforced in another? That's kind of, if you want, the core of private international law, and that is really what I want to focus on here. More broadly, we'd say all those areas that deal with such international litigation, so especially aspects of civil procedure like transboundary service of process or taking evidence, and uniform private law like the Convention on the International Sale of Goods. And then, to be true, we'd have to be even broader and include international commercial arbitration. I will not do that. I'm just flagging this here to say all of that, of course, matters as well. What does matter to me here, and I'll start with that already, is what the basis of this actually is. Because there's always been a debate whether this exists in, whether private international law is international law, or whether it's domestic law, or indeed whether it's constitutional or quasi-constitutional law. And that matters to what we're going to see in a moment. One tendency says that private international law is international law, or public international law, in the sense that it allocates competences. It allocates to different states the competence to adjudicate a case or to have their law applied. And that, say some people, is essentially a function of public international law. In the traditional sense of international law is law between states. Here you see on the left Ernst Zitelmann, famous German scholar who made that thesis around the turn of the century between the 19th and 20th century. You see Alex Mills from UCL in London, who has a modern version of that, I would say. And then you have on the right a signifier to say there's also human rights law, and a lot of private international law is also based on human rights law, and thereby also, if you want, transnationalized, based on a higher sphere, depoliticized maybe also, in the hope that there's some international law determining this. We'll come back to that towards the end. If we look within states, then one thing that matters is the Constitution, that, if you want, performs a similar function, that it allocates competences between the member states of the European Union, if you take that as Constitution, or the states of the United States, or indeed the provinces of Canada. In the United States, an important source would be the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution that says full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state, which is read to say states have to apply each other's law and recognize and enforce each other's judicial decisions. And you see a similar quasi-constitutional function in the case law of the European Court of Justice. Here's a slide from a recent decision. This is from September last year, in fact, of the Court of Justice. And the issue is whether one member state has to recognize a same-sex marriage celebrated in another member state, even if that state, Poland in this case, does not recognize same-sex marriage in its own system. And the court says yes, and the court says this is a function of the free movement protected in the European Union. So because you're allowed to move freely across borders, you have to do so in the identity that you have, and if that identity is to be in a same-sex marriage, then you're entitled to do that. So that's a quasi-constitutional approach, if you want, that combines human rights, the right underlying same-sex marriage, with a transboundary recognition duty and free movement here, in a sense like the full faith and credit clause. There's also an idea that private international law is actually domestic. And one example that I would have here is on the top there, if you'll focus on that. The German Civil Code, but a lot of states have such codes, or they have such common law rules. You can see here, unless EU law or international law applies, the applicable law is to be determined whether facts of a case have a connection with a foreign state by the provisions of this chapter. So we have a domestic statute, a German statute, that will determine when German law applies and when foreign law applies. So that's no longer based in international law. This is now a domestic political choice. And can, of course, then come in conflict with the choices taken by other states. Germany says Nigerian law applies, and Nigeria says German law would apply, as one example. And then you have mixes. And one mix is here the Rome II regulation. That's the regulation on the law applicable to non-contractual obligations. As also a general rule, if you look at Article 4, then the applicable law is normally the law of the place where the damage occurs. In case of a tort, you can still hear me, right? Okay, good. And then you see in Article 3, any law specified by this regulation shall be applied whether or not it is the law of a member state. And now we have something interesting and something relevant also for my contact. That is, we apply the same laws within the entity and outside the entity. Within Europe, the same rules as outside of Europe. To some extent, because we saw in the Court of Justice at the same time, there are certain rules, free movement, for example, that apply specifically within the European Union. So we universalize here what is a particular approach. The statutory aspect says it is domestic law that determines also what applies abroad. And here the quasi-constitution, the Rome regulation says it is we have the same rules within the European Union and outside the European Union. Theoretically, we treat Kenya the same way that we treat Italy. And in fact, that's not what we do. And in fact, we've never done that. And there's a bit of a smokescreen here, as you'll see, I hope, in a moment. So, how is this a European discipline? It's not entirely a European discipline, obviously. That is, it emerges specifically from Europe, but is then really developed further very strongly in North America. Joseph Story in the United States is one of the most important scholars in the 19th century. It emerges strongly in Latin America. The first codifications are Latin American. But the sources, the origins of the way of thinking are European, I would suggest. And that's why I place this in Europe. What characterizes this approach to private international law? And take only choice of law, take the question of the applicable law. First, we treat private international law as autonomous. That is, the rules that determine the applicable law are independent from substantive law, private law. They're probably also independent from international law. We have a separate body of rules that determine what law applies. Second, we have an openness towards foreign law, sometimes so far as to say there's no hierarchy between lex fori and lex causa, that is, between a court's own law and the foreign law. We do not prioritize our own law over that of a foreign state. You saw the rule on the law applicable to torts, and wherever that falls, that's going to be the applicable law. If the damage occurs in India, then Indian law will apply. If the damage occurs in Quebec, then the law of Quebec will apply. But there's no a priori preference for Quebec over India. Related to that, the equivalence of legal systems. So not only are we open to apply foreign law, we also don't have a hierarchy between these laws. Fourthly, we treat this as technical, apolitical, neutral. At least that was true for a long time, towards the end of the 20th century, to say everything substantive, political, etc. is going to be in the substantive law. And obviously substantive laws differ, and they differ on political grounds, but we choose the applicable law not on the basis of political grounds. That is not because we prioritize our own governmental interests over those of the foreign country. That is the US approach, it's not the European approach. Not because we think that one of the laws is better than the other, but on formal grounds like, as you saw, the place of the damage. And then lastly, private international law in this sense is state-based in three senses. That is, first, private international law is state law. You saw the German code. Second, private international law designates only the law of states. That is, the applicable law is going to be the law of Nigeria, but not the Islamic law of a particular ethnic group in Nigeria. And third, it's state-based in terms of its method. I'm not going to go into detail there because that becomes too technical. How did private international law acquire these qualities? Through contingent developments in Europe. That is, this particular kind of discipline could emerge only against the background of specific conditions in Europe. One of those is a relative balance of powers in Europe. That is, in areas where we have strong dominance of one state over others, China in East Asia, or the Ottoman Empire in its region of influence, we don't have this equivalence of legal systems. We have really the clear priority of that dominant powers law. But in Europe for a long time we didn't have that, and that's one situation against which this equivalence and this openness could emerge. Second, there's a similarity between the laws that apply. And this is based in part on Roman law origins, certainly in continental Europe. England obviously is slightly different. In different ways, the common law origins in the United States made it possible to have this Joseph Story law in the 19th century. So similar methodological background, but also a similar ideological background in a common source in Christianity. That is, private international law was the law among Christian nations, and therefore it was not so hard to say we apply the law of a foreign nation because it's still a Christian nation. And that means the difference is not going to be so strong. That survives really into secularization, if we understand secularization as post-Christianity really. And then finally, an important basis is commerce. That is the idea that a common commercial area requires mutual recognition, in this sense, something that comes back within the European Union. Now, this is, if you want, the contingency of a private international law that then becomes universalized. But if decolonial theory says that modernity always has a dark underbelly that is coloniality, and that the inside also has an outside, then we see that outside really in the colonial background of private international law, in its colonial history. Because these values that I just mentioned apply really within European and private international law, but they do not apply outside of Europe, at least historically. I'm simplifying a little here, but broadly this is the case. So private international law is not autonomous from other areas. It is closely linked to constitutional law or the law of empire. It's not open to foreign law insofar as that foreign law is not European, not Christian. And it has no equivalence of legal systems. It is not really apolitical or neutral. It is clearly a technique of governance. And it has to account somehow for non-state laws insofar as non-European normative orders in the colonies are non-state quality. Let me look at those briefly, one by one. First, constitutional law, empire. I can really refer to an excellent study by Roxana Bano that's just come out of the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies. She looks at how the British Empire deals with its colonies. And the colonies are at the same time inside and outside the empire. They're inside for some purposes and outside for other purposes. What does that mean for private international law, for the relations between the laws or the norms in the colonies and those in the center in London? Sometimes that will be dealt with on a constitutional basis. It's kind of the constitutional relations between the UK itself and its colonies, and sometimes as though these are different countries, as that means through private international law rules. Sometimes we'll refer to the laws in the colonies as foreign law, and sometimes we'll refer to that as English law. And so there's a vagueness there, but in each of those cases, there's a dependence, obviously, on other areas of the law. Second, openness to foreign law and equivalence. We find clearly that in the colonies, customary law in particular is going to be applied only if it is not repugnant to natural justice, equity, and good conscience. This is from a Nigerian rule, but we really have these in a lot of colonies. We also have them in a lot of post-colonial contexts. A lot of states maintain these rules. But that clearly creates a hierarchy between state law and non-state law, because natural justice, equity, and good conscience are historically valued against English values, of course. Natural justice is essentially according to English principles. The good conscience is the good conscience of Englishmen. And so customary law is hierarchically inferior. It only becomes applicable insofar as it is compatible with that. We find that private international law becomes a technique of governance. I don't want to go into too much detail in there, except to say that the idea of indirect rule, that is to maintain local self-governance for locals and just put a colonial overlay over that, is done deeply through private international law rules that allocate the space of colonial law and the space of domestic law. And in the same way, we have a curious role here for non-state orders and systems that can become applicable here, unlike in UK, but only filtered through this repugnancy clause. And so in the colonial context, perhaps not surprisingly, private international law does not operate the same way as it does between independent European nations. We could think that it would operate the same way with regard to other independent nations that are not colonies. But we see quite clearly that that's not the case, that effectively the law of non-European states is not applied in the same way. You have to go through a lot of case analyses to do that. You can see, but you can also see how scholars of the field explicitly confine private international law to their own area. Here's a quote from Westlake, an important private international lawyer, 19th century. There are nations like the Turks or the Chinese whose views and ways are so different from ours that we could not establish at all between them and us a system of private international law, by which effect might, as a general rule, be given in Christian states to their laws and judgments. Dicey, the most important scholar of private international law in the UK, and of course also of constitutional law, so there you have the connection, suggested quite clearly the rules of so-called private international law only apply among Christian states. This is the 19th century, and you have a secularized French version here from 1945. Nous devons protéger notre civilisation occidentale contre la cause d'affaiblissement qui résulterait pour elle d'une pénétration des mœurs des orientaux établis en Europe ou de l'assimilation des Européens par les mœurs orientales. Par conséquent, il nous appartient de déclarer inapplicables en France toutes les institutions étrangères relevant d'une civilisation qui pourrait corrompre la nôtre. So you really see, we're back here, if you want, submission, translated into private international law. There's a fear here of Islamic law in particular, and a rejection in private international law. And what's important to see is these are two sides of the same coin, right? So because private international law rested on the idea of a relative similarity of values based in Christianity, it follows almost logically to say that where that similarity of values cannot be assumed, that is, in relation to the rest of the world, the foundation of private international law breaks down, and the very justification that exists among Christian nations turns against, becomes an argument to not extend that internationally. This was clearly recognized in the 19th century. It is not so much recognized in the 20th, 21st century anymore. You saw before that the rules of the Rome regulation apply uniformly, whether the foreign country is one within the European Union or whether it is one somewhere else. And so it seems that private international law has universalized in that sense. But at the same time, remember the amnesia that Upendra Bakshi mentioned. It has forgotten how much it remains in this Christian tradition. And it becomes thereby, unwittingly perhaps, a missionary concept, a post-Christian concept of imposing a certain idea on the rest of the world. Let me give you one example here in what I call colonial continuity that emerges from extraterritorial application, in this case, of European law. This is a little dated. I think it still serves well. We have the the directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. We now have a more modern version that takes away here some of the private claims, so it's a little harder to make the case. But essentially the idea is here, there are certain human rights that have to be enforced throughout the entire production chain. Production often happens outside of Europe in low-wage countries in which human rights, so it is assumed, are not complied with. And so we want to make sure that we reach those as well, and so we impose on European companies the duty, I'm simplifying here, to enforce those values through the production chain down to the producers and distributors elsewhere. And in some ways, this seems like a good thing, and to many Europeans, liberal Europeans, leftist Europeans, it seemed like a good thing because we like human rights, we like corporate responsibility, and we like the idea that that is somehow combined to make sure that human rights are complied with in the rest of the world. And truth be told, there are some other countries in which people also thought this was a good idea. So I've heard from Brazil, for example, people say this is actually a good impetus for us in Brazil to improve our human rights situation. So I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing. I am saying, however, that this has a colonial structure which makes it intrinsically problematic. What is that colonial structure? Now, first is quite simply, it is still the case that here that Europe makes laws for Africa. Putting in Africa, you could put in other countries. Not directly, they're not making the African laws, but they're making the laws that indirectly apply in Africa, because effectively producers in Africa have to comply with European law. Arno Bradford calls that the Brussels effect, the effect that Brussels effectively makes laws for the rest of the world. We see that here quite clearly. It becomes direct through the application, and indirectly because corporations, interestingly, are now becoming enforcers of EU standards because they have to make sure that these rules are complied with the effect that we have a European standardization that comes in this corporate law as a quasi-universalization. We have European set values that are imposed on the rest of the world. Counter-argument immediately, this is human rights, and so those are universal, those are not particular European. There's the common critique to say that human rights are really Western biased. There's a second, more legalistic critique that says human rights law is effectively treaty law, it is not natural law. And so imposing it on states that are not members to human rights treaties is extraterritorial, even if we think these are good. But the most important point, perhaps, is it matters who applies and interprets these human rights laws. And if this is European law, this is going to be negotiated and litigated in European courts. And that means there's necessarily going to be a European perspective on this application. We see that in the United States with the Alien Tort Statute, under which human rights litigation happened in the United States for events that took place outside of the United States. And we find the same thing here, effectively. So we have a situation, Europe takes Africa and applies those through private international law to situations that would normally be governed by foreign law. Remember the place of the damage. If that damage occurs in Zambia, normally Zambian law would apply, but here it becomes European law that applies. That wouldn't be such a big problem if we had, in fact, a meaningful participation in the lawmaking from countries of the global south. But what we find quite frequently in this situation, we did not have that. We had actors from the global south involved who overwhelmingly supported the framework, and possibly that was a matter of how they were selected and represented. Virtually all of the participants from the south had connections to NGOs based in the north, and in the end they did not play a significant role in the alliances that formed to comment on the proposal. So we have participation from the global south, and effectively we have very little, something that we find of course also in international lawmaking. Not surprisingly, we also find that in European lawmaking. One consequence from this is insufficient attention to local requirements. One example, a lot of the laws that are made in Europe have employee protection, but in economies in which labor is organized differently, in which we don't have normal contractual employment relations, this is just not going to apply to those who need to be protected. So what we have here, as little as what in other contexts is called a white savior complex, that is the idea that Europeans know better what Africans need, and therefore make laws of which they think that they're going to be productive, but in effect they're not. And then of course there's also a fourth aspect that is a little less benign perhaps, and that is the attempt to raise costs of production in order to make sure that manufacturers are in Europe are protecting. There's a concern that the offshoring that happens in capitalism enables manufacturers to undercut labor protections of European workers and possibly establish high standards in the rest of the world as well. So there's real competition there. That offshoring enables third countries to develop industrial and technological capacities and become systemic rivals of the EU. And so this is also one way of maintaining control over that. So there's one way I would suggest in which there's a colonial continuity in private international law. Seemingly benign European law is made to apply also in countries in which human rights protection is a problem, but effectively has all the elements of old coloniality, a mix of European sense of superiority in knowing what the right things are, and effectively a commercial exploitation, and the avoidance of meaningful local competition. Now, the other aspect, what I call false universalism. We saw that these rules emerge from a European context, or a North American context, but we also see that the same type of rules really exists in all other parts of the world. I think you could say that, with the exception of the United States, where private international law really has a peculiar nature, almost all areas of the world have the same kinds of types, if you want, of private international law systems. I list two aspects of that down there. One is that territoriality is the main connecting factor, the place of the tort, the place of contract performance, etc. Party autonomy is another one, and there's a restriction to state laws as the applicable laws. We have very little private international law that directly designates non-state law to apply. And so what you see up there is a number of non-European private international law codifications, the Latin American codes from the 19th century, and more recent examples is the draft OHADA model law relating to private international law. There was an attempt also for OHADA that I think has been paused. With Asian principles of private international law, we have these African principles on the law applicable to international commercial contracts. All of those look almost exactly like the European models. The African principles, in fact, are modeled by a South African professor after an international model law, the Hague principles, and the Hague principles in turn are modeled after the Rome I regulation after European law. So really all these are called African principles. They look very European. And now it could, of course, theoretically be the case that what worked well in Europe would also work well in other areas of the law. But that is what would need to be tested, and for a long time that wasn't really tested. So we find in some of these African models that they're really written in part by French law professors and in part by African law professors who studied in France. And so unsurprisingly, they would adopt French models. And the kind of radically different thinking that might be required is still very rare in this area, maybe even rarer than in public international law. There are some attempts to do that, and I'll just list three to give you a sense of that. The first, this is fairly modest here from Collier and Apon, 2024, critique of the African principle that I named, where they suggest this is by and large fine, but we need some African specificities. We need a broader protection of weaker parties because we need more of that protection in Africa than you may need in Europe. We need a limitation of party autonomy because the conditions for party autonomy are absent in Africa, and that is not only questions of illiteracy that are often named, but also questions of the kind of market regulation that is required for meaningful party autonomy. And thirdly, they suggest that the place of performance for contracts should have a more prominent role or maybe be more meaningful, because that would lead to more frequent application of African law in export contracts. They suggest essentially that apologies, we have an unexpected snowstorm here. I don't know if that's what happened. I know that's, of course, a joke to say that in Canada.
Good.
But maybe we're not as good at that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm almost through. Anyway, so I mentioned the reform proposal by Okoli Opan. Or, if you want, revolutionary suggestion is to Joy Jimenez. This is neo-colonial, although her proposal then remains largely in saying we have to expand private international law to non-state laws. And maybe the potentially most radical approach comes from India. This is Ramani Sai Garimella, who suggests that private international law is all colonial altogether and needs to be based really in public international law, or she even says natural law, but some kind of non-European natural law. So we have these beginnings of saying we need conceptions here that are different from those emerging from European private international law. What follows from that, and then up through, from my perspective as a scholar, a research program. And that would mean first to have a historiography that is more open to looking at these colonial origins to overcome the amnesia that Bakshi spoke about. Second, the question of colonial continuities in the global north, to expand what I just said, to see to what extent global south countries are treated differently in Europe, like their law applied less, their courts not considered competent, etc. The other would be colonial continuities in the global south, that is to see to what extent do non-northern countries replicate colonial structures within their own systems and thereby continue coloniality. The fourth would be the hope of an understanding that transcends individual states and looks at private international law as something transnational that includes the north-south divide but also transcends it. That is, an understanding as a transnational system rather than a bunch of isolated domestic laws. And the fifth question is really one that I call here delinking, as a term from decolonial theory. That idea was that global south economies have to be delinked from global commerce and economy. And for us in private international law, that would really radically reopen the question whether foreign law should remain applicable, or whether indeed, in fact, countries in the global south should refuse to apply foreign law. And we have seen such attempts in the past. The Calvo Doctrine in Latin America is a bit of that. And that would be a thing to look at seriously as well. But that's the research program for me. It's not for you, unless you want to take part, obviously. And I'll close here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Michaels. And so I'll take it from here. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être là. Merci pour l'invitation. I'm really grateful to Alex, Vincent, and the whole team for organizing this event. And I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Professor Michaels today. And I look forward eventually to welcoming you and seeing you at NYU in a different future, different setting. So my name is Toussaint, and I am a communication scholar. I'm broadly interested in inequalities and technology. And in particular, for over a decade now, I've been researching digital technologies and inequalities inherited from colonialism. I've been interested in how historical inequalities shape contemporary digital technologies. And conversely, vice versa, I've also examined how digital technologies accelerate, reinvent, and at times challenge colonial inequalities. Throughout my work, I approach these questions from a post-colonial perspective. And here, this approach holds that colonialism is not merely a thing of the past, but continues to shape our contemporary institutions and societies, including our media systems and legal frameworks. At the same time, this approach does not assume that these power relations persist in self-evident ways, nor that they are unchallenged or even impossible to overcome, or at least to reduce, if not overcome. Not unlike Professor Michaels' sort of critical genealogy of private international law today, and as it relates to the Global South. My approach is broadly social constructivist. Historical and geographical contingencies profoundly shape our institutions, including, and perhaps especially, those with universal aspirations. This holds true for law, just as it does for digital technologies, two domains that have often claimed universality, even as they emerge from very particular positions of power. It's been a real pleasure to read Professor Michael's paper and to hear him speak about it right now. And I've learned a great deal reading it and also listening again. For those of you, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the paper, but it's really clear, it's sharp, it's direct, and it really does not shy away from addressing complex questions and conundrums related to the colonial lineage of private international law. It's both technical and big picture in that sense. By examining the history of private international law, Professor Michael suggests that it is colonial in two ways. As he puts it, and I'm quoting here, the Global South is confronted with a private international law that is itself genealogically and structurally a law of the Global North, both in its specific development and in the characteristics based on this development. In other words, it is colonial genealogically, in the sense that it emerged from colonial institutions, contexts, power relations, and structurally, in that its core characteristics reflect those biases. Private international law may appear apolitical at home in Europe, sorry, this is New York. Private international law may appear apolitical at home in Europe, but from a global perspective, it is deeply political. And as he puts it unambiguously, it was an instrument of indirect rule. This sort of critical genealogy reminded me of the work of Wendy Williams, who is a leading scholar of media and the Global South. She recently offered, so someone from my corner of academia, really. She recently offered a critique of one of the foundational concepts in our understanding of the modern nation state, the public sphere, as developed by Jürgen Habermas, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, including many of the canonical critics too. But she used a sort of similar genealogical approach to reinterpret Habermas' account of the bourgeois public sphere in relation, in her case, to slavery and imperialism. She reminds us, for instance, in that paper that coffee houses in Britain, which are often idealized as key sites in the emergence of public sphere, were also deeply entangled in the slave trade, including as meeting points and trading points for those involved in it. Structurally, Williams showed that the very concept of the public sphere is fraught. She writes, by only focusing on the emancipatory nature of the public sphere, scholars of liberal modernity have adopted partial, wide vantage points, which have led them to neglect the racial violence required to make this space possible. Against the canonical use of public sphere theory in communication and political science, Williams offers a genealogical critique aimed at structural reinvention of the concept. The public sphere, she shows, was never a matter of nation states alone. It was always transnational from the get-go, and yet deeply unequal. And these inequalities have profoundly shaped how scholars in the field think about media and journalism, including the values, the practices, and the regulatory frameworks. And so I see, I talk about this because I see Professor Michael's paper in sort of a similar light. It invites us to directly confront the colonial foundations of private international law. It requires a set of sort of deep technical expertise in the domain, as well as this sort of bigger picture engagement. This is work that personally I would describe as tiring and yet necessary. And especially if we are to envision systems and institutions better equipped to address global relations and disputes in a more just way, quite simply. I say tiring because in some sense, you know, and maybe, you know, Professor Michaels can talk to this, but there is some level of a lot of these issues have been talked about, and yet reckoning as scholars in our own disciplines with what they mean for the foundations of our frameworks is work that's necessary. But at the same time, the paper is also very ambitious and generative in carving out a future research agenda. And I was particularly struck by the call for more interdisciplinary work, bringing legal scholarship into dialogue with international relations, anthropology, as well as decolonial approaches. And so in that spirit, I would like to offer a few reflections from my adjacent perspective. You know, disciplinarily, my work may seem parallel to Professor Michaels' legal scholarship. But what I hope to do today is to invite us to think of our fields not as running side by side in sort of 2 dimensions, but as intersecting in 3 dimensions. And seen in this way, our approaches are less parallel and more intertwined. And so that is the spirit of my response, really. How do digital technologies and their global expansion relate to private international law? What might the current state of the tech industry reveal about its colonial dimensions? So to explore these questions, I want to ground some of these broader themes, and also that are also discussed in the paper, in a few concrete examples. And these examples come largely from the Kenyan context, which has been a central focus of my research over the past decade and research around digital colonialism. And so here I'm gonna pause and briefly step away from my script to tell the story of 3 ongoing lawsuits in Kenya. These are 3 ongoing lawsuits in Kenya against Meta, which is the parent company of Facebook. And so I'll talk a bit about this and then draw out some observations in relation to Professor Michaels' paper. So I want to start the story with someone called Daniel Motong. He's from South Africa. And, you know, a few years ago, upon graduating from university with a degree in sociology, applied for a job. He comes from a very rural area of South Africa, an impoverished part of the country. But, you know, he had high hopes of uplifting himself and his family out of financial hardship. And, you know, having received his degree, he applied to a job that sounded exciting. It was for a tech company, as far as I understood it, and the nature of the job was essentially described in terms of community management and sort of community management. He applied for the job, especially because the job required some linguistic skills that he had. You know, South Africa being a multilingual country. And he got the job. And when he got the job, was very excited. He signed a contract, including an NDA. And then he was flown from South Africa to Kenya. You know, by his own account, it was his first time on a plane. He was very sort of optimistic and excited about the situation. And upon arriving in Kenya, he received a brief training working for a company called Sama. And Sama was a subcontractor for Facebook who had been hired by Facebook to do content moderation, especially for a range of African languages, and to do this based in Kenya. Upon arriving, he gets his training, and a few hours after a couple of hours of training is made to basically moderate content. I will share only one detail of that and won't expand more on the gruesomeness of it. But one of the first videos he had to moderate was one of a live beheading. And from then on, a long stream of violent, gory, terrible content. He was made to do this work for a rate of $1.5 to $2 an hour. His first instinct was to go back to South Africa, but didn't have the money to pay for a flight, so decided to stick with it. Eventually, after some time, he started to develop both mental health issues and started to talk with his colleagues, like, are you experiencing the same thing as me? Like, this is awful, like, I can't keep doing this work. He tried to organize his colleagues to ask for better work conditions, mental health support, career progression, better pay, on par with some of the moderators that work for that company, for instance, in Ireland or in the US. And that company being Facebook in that case. But he was, eventually fired by Sama and sent back to South Africa. They basically said that he was harassing his colleagues by asking for these issues and trying to unionize, create a union. And he went back to South Africa and traumatized by the experience. A few years later, a journalist who was investigating the subcontractor, Sama, and Facebook, heard about his story. Everyone mentioned like this South African guy who was trying to unionize and organize everyone. And he found him in his village in South Africa, and then Daniel decides to share his story. Makes the headline of Time magazine. Maybe some of you are interested in this question might have heard about it. It was the first sort of African content moderator to come out with his story. And soon after coming out with his story publicly, we had this wave of 3 lawsuits in Kenya. The first one is brought by him, along with sort of support from a legal team in Kenya and a legal team in the UK, a non-profit tech litigation group called Foxglove. And in their case, they filed a lawsuit in front of the labor court in Kenya, arguing in part inhuman work conditions as well as human trafficking. And that was the first lawsuit. When that first lawsuit was publicly announced, Meta decided to cut its contract with the subcontractor Sama, and then proceeded to develop a new contract with another subcontractor in the country, Majorel. They did this, and they also fired almost 200 moderators that used to work for the first subcontractor. And they said to the new subcontractor, essentially, like, don't hire these former employees, and starting from scratch here. Now, these employees who'd just been fired, several of them wanted to continue the work, just wanted better work conditions. In their perspective, their work is the front line of our digital ecosystems. It's important work, needs to be compensated properly. The point is not to not have work, the point is to have good work. And they decided to do a second lawsuit, and in this case for discriminatory hiring practices. This lawsuit is the same legal team, the same people involved. And here it's again a lawsuit against the labor and work court in Kenya. The third and last lawsuit has to do with less of the sort of supply chain of production of the moderation of the content on these platforms, but more with the impact of these platforms. The third lawsuit is also brought in Kenya, but it has to do with hate speech in Ethiopia. It's actually brought by a member of the Ethiopian diaspora who is neither in Kenya or in Ethiopia, whose father was killed after messages were put on the Meta platform calling for the killing of his father against the policies of the platform. And in this lawsuit, they allege that the lack of moderation, not enough moderation, too late, had a direct impact on the violation of human rights of people in the country. You might be wondering why they're doing this lawsuit in Kenya. Again, because the hub for the content moderation, the people doing the moderation, were based in Kenya. So these are the 3 lawsuits. Well, what does this have to do with private international law, with digital technologies in the global south? Quite a lot, of course. And we're at a state in these lawsuits where, the first sort of defining step has been sort of decided surprisingly. And it was about the question as to whether Facebook or Meta should be party to these lawsuits. Meta and its lawyers have used a very sort of familiar strategies, I'm sure to many of you who are interested in this question of subcontractors. They argue that they're a company incorporated in the US and Ireland. They are arguing that they were not the employer of these people, that they were, they had a contract with Sama, not with these individuals. And most of all, they argued that they are not doing business in Kenya, that Facebook and Meta is not doing business in Kenya. If there's any Kenyan in the room who just knows the tens of millions of users of the platform, not just for communication, but transferring money and any other things through WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook platforms. And as a non-lawyer, you're like, what do you mean you're not in Kenya? You're obviously, you have tens of millions of users, people paying for your products, using your products for each others, and so on. But anyway, it's kind of the classic response from the company, which has been very damaging and influential, I think, in the sort of outsourcing model in preventing some forms of accountability. But the Kenyan courts have been surprisingly responsive to the claims that are being made by the lawyer representing the content moderators. The team representing the content moderators have been arguing, well, first we're going to show you that they are effectively doing business in the country, that they have significant operation as well as financial stakes. We'll show you also that the contract of employment was exclusive for these people who were only doing work for Meta products, Meta platforms, that they were receiving messages from the Meta offices. This is all material submitted in evidence of being addressed as the Kenyan team by people who are in the company. And most of all, because of the use of proprietary software that these employees were using to do the moderation, which was software from Meta. And so on that ground, the Kenyan courts have been saying, well, you know what, actually, we're going to rule against removing Meta from these lawsuits, and we're going to proceed and, sort of recognize that they should be part of this. Classic sort of, a turn of, jurisdiction sort of decision that was, to observers in the sort of tech accountability space, fairly surprising. Perhaps even dare I say it's slightly hopeful in some sense. Now, these cases in Kenya extend important question raised in Professor Michael's paper for private international law. And I'm sure more than the ones that I'll just outline, but, and I'm going to conclude on this. The first concerns the nature of the actors and the inequalities involved here. Professor Michael's paper focuses largely on inequalities between state actors, former colonizing and colonized countries, and to a lesser extent between state and non-state actors, especially in indigenous communities. But in the Kenyan case, however, these inequalities are compounded by the imbalance between the companies involved and the states themselves. So take, for instance, Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google. A few years ago, it had a market capitalization of $786 billion US, which at the time was the equivalent of the GDP of 38 African countries. Just one company, 38 African countries in sort of, economic power. And today, and these are from a few years ago, these numbers are even higher and even more stark. So these tech companies are not state actors, but they are also, in my opinion, not simply companies. They are something quite different in size and scope. They're certainly richer and more powerful than many countries and states in the global south. More than that, their products are not merely products. Their operations and technologies cut across the fabric of our societies with implications for business, health, politics, and much, much more. And this is why they're sometimes described as a new form of empire. There's a whole sort of literature around data and digital colonialism, and that spread across communication studies as well as social legal studies and computer science. And we're seeing sort of this wave of thinking about these new types of actors, really. And so my question really here is, how is private international law to respond? And where does that fit in? The story I've been telling about Kenya sounds a bit uplifting, perhaps, in some sense, at least, the sort of the current, the current litigations in the country. And in some ways, it is. But Professor Michaels warns us against romanticizing the global south in the paper. And on that we agree. And in the Kenyan context, these lawsuits have faced significant government pushback, so much so that a bill is now being developed to prevent such cases in the future by shifting liability from big tech companies to subcontractors, effectively preventing any other type of similar litigation in Kenya. And that's because the government has been reacting to these lawsuits by saying, what are you doing? Like you're pushing our foreign investors away. We want to keep a good sort of partnership with them. And so if you're not going to drop these cases and they're going to move forward, we're going to change the rules. And so just as the Global South in that case is a space of resistance, it is also a place of complicity. And I think in sort of the future research agenda that's outlined, this will be key to address. And finally, Professor Michaels raises the question of unilateral universalism, which is a concept that that's used a lot in the paper, and whether public international law from the global north inevitably perpetuates inequalities. Intrinsically problematic, inescapable. These are all sort of these ideas that I think came through as sort of core questions in the paper. And when looking at the Kenyan context from my vantage point, we see this patchwork of global distributed actors. South African worker employed by a subcontractor in Kenya, working with a company registered in the US and Ireland, whose product reaches users worldwide. A Kenyan legal team supported by a UK-based tech litigation NGO. And in the case of the third lawsuit, a member of the Ethiopian diaspora based in a European country, bringing suit in Kenya over harms experienced in their home country of Ethiopia. Is this an inescapably unequal system? Or should it push us to think about both the possibility and urgency of new frameworks, creative forms of solidarity across global north and global south, and perhaps even different types of careers and interdisciplinary legal training? I'm not a legal scholar, and I'd love to hear from people in the room and from Professor Michaels too, how you might think about the future of training in your discipline that's trying to wrestle with this. How do you train, new lawyers, but also what sort of pipelines might we imagine as careers? So I offer these thoughts as very much open questions rather than answers, and certainly rather than, criticisms. They point, in my view, to the centrality of private international law in our digitally interconnected yet unequal world, and to its centrality to a range of deep political questions. And they also underscore the importance of interdisciplinary approaches, which was, in my opinion, one of the key takeaways from the paper. So for these reasons, I'm really grateful to be here with you all today, even if only online, and to have had the opportunity to read this paper. And yeah, thank you so much. I'll stop now, and we can open the floor.
Thank you. I think it's time to finish. Let me thanks a lot, Rolf and Toussaint, for being here. It was a pleasure to have you, even if it was online. I hope next time we will have the opportunity to invite you in real person here in Montreal. And please, all the team here will be pleased to continue to have some contact with you. We have now seminar with all the members of the team, and we presenting a couple of papers. Some of them maybe we will be pleased to send it to you if you have some comment about it. It will be a pleasure to have an input with you on a perspective. So thank you so much, Ralph and Toussaint, for being here. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And special thanks to Toussaint for those great comments.
Of course.
And thanks everyone organizing.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Take
À
care.
la prochaine.
Des enjeux techniques.
Okay.